Good evening, and thank you for joining us. My name is Kelly Kowal. I'm the Regional Director for the Upper Coast Management Team here in Coastal Fisheries. And I'm going to be talking to you today about the oyster certificate application process. And I'll be joined by Zach Olson, who will be talking about the siting process. Zach, you want to say hello?
Hey y'all, yeah, thanks. I'll be hopping in to talk about the siting process. Zach Olson, Texas Parks and Wildlife Department. I'm the director of the Ecosystem Resources Program.
And we are also joined by Amy Nunez and Danielle DeVach with the GLO, and they're here just to provide a little bit of support in the event that you all have questions that might be geared more towards their organization. So I'm going to share my screen and we'll start the presentation. All right. Can everyone see that okay? All right. So this is the Oyster Certificate of Location application and siting process presentation. We are going to be doing this in 2 in-person workshops later on this week. So the agenda tonight will include a program background, the timeline, how to begin this process, some considerations, the application process, including the natural resource survey, which is 3 parts, the marine spatial planning tool, a sonar survey, and a ground survey. We'll include general siting considerations and discuss the public hearing. And then we will move on to the conditional authorization, the other agencies involved in the process, and finalizing the COL process. So just as background for this, anyone who may not be familiar with it, COLs historically have been areas for on-bottom oyster harvest, for private on-bottom oyster harvest. They were historically associated with oyster transplants, and modern CLOs place culch for natural oyster settlement rather than transplanting oysters. The location holders have the sole rights to the oysters on those COLs. Currently, the COLs exist only in Galveston Bay. There are 43 of them, consisting of 2,318 acres. They range from 11 to 100 acres each, and they are responsible for between 9 and 36% of the Texas annual oyster harvest. This program has been expanded to also include COLs for the purpose of restoration. So this program will now not only include COLs that can be harvested, but it will also have COLs that will be created exclusively to be preserved for the benefits that they provide the environment. So this is the timeline. We will begin consultations on August 4th. And the application period will begin September 1st and end on November 30th of 2025. So how do you begin? Applicants should consider where they would like a new certificate of location to be cited. It would be best if you come to TPWD with an idea of where you want to put that location. It will make it a little bit more streamlined, and we can pull in the appropriate ecosystem leader if we know where you want to site this location into that initial consultation. Otherwise, that will have to happen at a later time. You can contact me to schedule an initial consultation. That's my email and my office number. Please understand that when we do schedule these consultations, there's going to be multiple staff involved. So it may take a few days worth of scheduling for us to get back to you to find a time that we can all accommodate you with the schedule. So considerations. One of the main considerations of the COL program is the cost. And we're using recent TPWD culch placement on restoration locations as an idea of what it can cost an individual or a company to participate in this process. So recent culch placement has ranged from $30,000 to $200,000 per acre, depending on the thickness of the acre. That's 1 inch versus a 6-inch layers. And then it's approximately $250 per cubic yard. And we'd like to note that we we contract all of this work out and do not use our own boats or labor. So the prices may vary depending on what an applicant is able to do with their own equipment and staff. It's also important to recognize that no corporation other than those incorporated under the state laws of Texas may lease or control land under a certificate of location. Annual rental fees for harvest COLs is due every year by March 1st. And TBD will need to be notified in advance of any placement of mulch on a COL, as well as the fact that oyster harvest permits are required before any oysters can be taken from a COL. So again, to start the application process, you will contact me to set up a consultation and discuss the process. The next step will be a desktop consultation with the Marine Spatial Planning tool, and then you will verify that site availability with the GLO. The next step will be for the applicant to develop a mulch placement plan, which can be kind of broad, and we can assist with, what the expectations of that plan are. Once that plan has been put in place, the applicant will submit an application, the application fee, and required documents, which include the mulch placement plan, maps, and a variety of diagrams. The next part of the process will include the natural resources survey. The applications will then be reviewed by coastal fisheries staff, and the applicant will make any changes to the application needed with the guidance of coastal fisheries staff. There will then be a public hearing. If the public hearing does not yield anything that's concerning and we agree to go forward with the certificate of location, we will issue a conditional authorization. And then you take this conditional authorization to the other agencies, and that will give them evidence that we have, you have worked through the TPWD process and that you can move forward with the authorizations through them and getting a lease. Coastal Fisheries will review the lease and authorizations once they've been acquired. The applicant will get a prorated rental fee, and that will have to be paid prior to the final COL being issued. So this is a basic flow chart of that process, just walking step by step through the process and through what each step the applicant will be required to go through. So for the application process, a separate application will be required for each proposed COL. An area will be considered reserved for an applicant once TPWD accepts an application, and the natural resources survey must be initiated within 6 months of the submission of the application. If it has not been started, the application can be denied. So I'm going to turn this over to Zach so he can talk to you about the natural resources survey.
Thanks, Kelly. Yeah, let me just run through our natural resources survey associated with these certificates of location. So some of y'all might be familiar with this process in the oyster mariculture program, and it follows a fairly similar route, just with some slight differences between the survey requirements. So really 3 steps to the natural resources survey. I'll go into each one of these a little bit more in depth in the coming slides. Number 1, there's a desktop consultation with Texas Parks and Wildlife Department, primarily to assess any mapped user conflicts before going out and conducting any field surveys. The second is a required sonar survey conducted by the applicant with extensive guidance from TPWD. Goal there is to assess the footprint of any sensitive habitats in the area, namely oyster beds or seagrass. And then lastly is a ground survey, again conducted by the applicant with guidance from TPWD. That's to verify that sonar image and then to assess any reef degradation when the COL is being sited on known oyster reef footprint. Next slide, Kelly. So a little more detail about that natural resources desktop consultation. Again, the main purpose of that is to assess site suitability for any possible user conflicts in the field. And our main reason for that is because we just want to try to avoid any input of labor or resources, if there's just anything we know about that could stop that COL from being cited there. Um, and so, as Kelly mentioned, these desktop consultations will go best if the applicant comes in with a proposed locations, or the general area of those proposed locations, so that we can kind of focus that consultation. But just some examples of the things that we would look for in that marine spatial planning tool. We'd look at any mapped habitats, rookery islands, conservation areas, any navigational concerns, oil and gas infrastructure, Department of State Health Services, shellfish designation areas, and then any other known conflicts. And I'll note that TPWD is not the authority on all of those uh, possible user conflicts, but we do try our best to provide some of that information as a service to the applicant early in the planning process. Next slide, please. So next, once we settle on a certificate of location area, that applicant, as Kelly was saying, would then submit an application, and from there, the applicant would move forward with a sonar survey. Again, purpose of that to assess the presence and footprint of any unmapped oyster beds and seagrass habitat. We'll be providing guidance on that sonar survey, what that needs to look like, to the applicant. We do allow for the use of recreational grade sonar units, assuming that the outputs of those are high quality. There may be a required seasonality to that survey. For example, if it's in water or a location shallow enough that there may be seagrass present, we would require that survey to occur during the seagrass growing period. But assuming that we're outside of that, of a potential seagrass area, those sonar surveys could occur year round. Next slide, Kelly. And the last part of that natural resource survey, the third step in that, is that ground survey. Really, two purposes there: to verify that sonar image and then to assess any oyster bed degradation levels if that site is slated to go on a known oyster bed footprint. So you recall one of the changes to this program in this iteration is that we are allowing for certificates of location to be cited on oyster bed footprint, assuming that those oyster beds are determined to be degraded. And we'll talk about what a degraded oyster bed might look like and how we're going to define that here in a second. But that's the main a point of this ground survey, is to assess that degradation of any oyster reef or oyster bed that these seawalls are sited on. So yeah, two survey components there. If we are on reef, then there'll be more of a quantitative survey, either a standardized sampling dredge, a hydraulic tong, or quadrat. And then there may be some additional authorizations there depending on season or status. If we are off reef, then that ground survey would be a little bit more straightforward, very similar to the mariculture survey, if some of you all are familiar with that. Essentially just a grab sample to verify what's being seen in that sonar image. Again, Parks and Wildlife will be providing extensive guidance all on sample design, sample size, what data to collect, providing all that guidance to the applicant throughout this process. So it'll be a very iterative back and forth process between Texas Parks and Wildlife Department and the applicant. Next slide, Kelly. And just give you a general idea of some of our general siting considerations. Some of the key siting stipulations we'll name here. We are requiring a 200-foot buffer for any COL locations with seagrass, a 200-foot buffer for any non-degraded oyster beds, a 1,000-foot bird rookery buffer. Existing mariculture seals or restoration sites, 1,000 foot. And that's typical of any sites that are not under the control of the applicant. There may be some flexibility there if the applicant is controlling any of those sites themselves. Oil and gas infrastructure, 1,000-foot buffer. Again, that's something that's under the GLO authority, but we'll be including the General Land Office in those early consultations and providing that information to applicants. And then harvested COLs will only be allowed to be sited in Department of State Health Services approved or conditionally approved areas. And then we may have some regional considerations just depending on some specifics of a particular bay system, whether that's threatened or endangered species in the area or what have you. Again, we'll provide both general siting sampling protocols and site-specific consultation for applicants throughout this process. And then I lastly want to talk about this degraded oyster bed threshold. Um, Again, I know there's a lot going on the screen here, but this is essentially a decision tree for getting to, is a bed degraded, and will we allow the citing of a certificate of location on that site? And this presentation will be available in case you don't have a chance to read all of this. But let me just kind of walk you through this kind of decision tree. Essentially, we'll consider three main aspects when deciding if a bed is degraded: the live oyster abundance, the shell or culch abundance, and the time since it was exhausted. And so that we have thresholds for both the live oyster abundance and the culch abundance. And so you can see those thresholds given there. Um, the first consideration is live oyster abundance, and the threshold we're using there is 0.2 oysters per meter squared. In a Parks and Wildlife sampling dredge, it's a sampling dredge that covers about 20 square meters. That's about between 3 and 4 oysters in that 20 square meter area. That's that threshold we're using there. And if we are above that threshold, then you can see on the bottom there that we wouldn't allow for the siting of a COL. But if we're below that threshold, we would then look at the availability of culch material or oyster shell on that site as an indicator of there being oysters live on that reef in recent years. Really, what we're trying to avoid here is citing certificates of location on areas that have recently had live oysters, but may not have live oysters currently because of a freshet that recently came through the area or a drought or something like that, when in reality those oysters would return as soon as that water quality improved. So we'd look then at the shell abundance of shell material on that reef, and you see that threshold there is 0.4 piece of shell per meter squared, and that's specifically brown shell, not black shell. If you are uh, above that threshold, if you're below that threshold, then we would cite a certificate of location on that site. If you're above that threshold, then we'd really just look for any other evidence that we might have that would suggest if that area has recently had oysters on that site. That might be other data from our monitoring program. That might be recent harvest records in that area. We might really lean into our public hearing to understand what the use of that area has been like. And then if there's no evidence that there's really been any number of live oysters on that site in the past 5 years, we would consider citing a certificate of location there. But if we do have evidence that there's been a non-degraded reef on that site in the past 5 years, then we would look to not cite a certificate of location there. So you can kind of see how this decision tree framework takes into account live oysters, culch or shell abundance, and then that time since exhausted in kind of a hierarchical manner to kind of get us to a decision on whether or not to cite a certificate of location. And so the information that would go into this would primarily be that information collected in the ground survey portion of the natural resources survey. And I believe that's it for citing, Kelly. I'll hand it back over to you.
All right. Well, once the natural resources survey has been completed and we've approved the footprint of the new COL with the applicant, the department will hold a public hearing to provide the opportunity for public comment. This hearing may be virtual or in person and will be announced via the TPWD website and any other outlets deemed necessary between 10 and 20 days prior to the hearing. The department will consider all comment relevant to the application, and the applicant will be notified within 14 days after the hearing of either disapproval or denial of the application. So once TPWD has approved an application and it's gone through the full process of the natural resource survey and the public hearing, then we will issue a conditional authorization. This authorization does not authorize any site activity. It is just a notification to outside agencies that the applicant has gone through the process with TPWD and is ready to start the process of getting the other documentation required to finalize this. So this will be a document that can be presented to outside agencies, and That will include the GLO, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, and the U.S. Coast Guard. So once the applicant has received all of the outside authorizations and leases, then they will bring that back to TPWD, and coastal fisheries staff will review it all. The applicant will then be responsible for submitting a prorated rental fee. And once we've received the rental fee and reviewed the documentation, a certificate will be issued for that location. So that is the end of the presentation, and we can move on with any questions that people may have.
Okay. All right. Well, we do have some questions coming through, and just as a reminder, if you want to ask any questions, there's a Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. Feel free to type them in here. I will just say that we are only going to be answering questions that are relevant to the certificate of location program here tonight. And if you have any other questions, either that aren't relevant to the certificate of location program or just somehow get missed tonight, feel free to email us and we'll get those questions answered for you. Okay, so the first question we have here is, what are the TPWD annual lease fees and the GLO surface lease fees? So this might be a question for Kelly and for either Amy or Danielle.
Yes, so the current TPWD annual lease fees are $24 per acre, but that is caveated with they are recalculated every 3 years based on the consumer price index increases. And that recalculation will occur back beginning in January of this year. So the fees that will be paid in March of this year will be different than that $24 per acre fee. And I don't know if Amy or Danielle would like to comment about the GLO.
Hello, sure. I can comment real quickly for the land office. Currently, we're still finalizing the lease fee associated with certificates of location, the associated surface lease. But it will be something, if you are familiar with the cultivated oyster mariculture surface lease fees, those are currently $500 a year. It will not exceed that. It will be something, a portion of that or lower than that. And we're still looking at some numbers as a starting point for those lease fees, and should have more information available to applicants in the very near future.
Great. Okay. Thank you, Amy. All right. Next question. Actually, a couple questions here that are similar in nature. It's all kind of group them together. They're kind of related to an oyster harvest permit. And so the question is, can you clarify an oyster harvest permit? Is that the same thing as a commercial oyster license?
No, that is not the same thing as a commercial oyster license. An oyster harvest permit is the permit that we issue to certificate of location holders so that they can harvest off of that location. It's issued currently monthly, and it will include the time period that you expect to be harvesting and the boats that will be harvesting from that location.
Thank you. And to be clear, though, an individual will need to have an oyster license to be able to harvest even off of a certificate of location. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay.
It's just they're two separate entities.
Yeah.
Any boat that harvests from a COL will need to have a oyster boat license.
Gotcha. And a similar question, if you don't have an oyster, I think license is what they mean here, and do not want to purchase one from an existing holder, can you contract with a permit holder if needed?
That would be a business decision and up to the location holder.
Okay. Next question, is there a requirement that for mulch to be placed on site with a specific time, within a specific time after the certificate of location is issued?
So we do have what we call minimum use criteria for restoration locations, and they are pretty broad, and we can, anyone who's interested in a restoration location, we can sit down and talk to you about what those criteria are. But it's just basically providing guidance to the department with what you plan to do with that location in a specific amount of time.
Thank you.
There are no minimum use criteria currently for a harvest location.
Next question here is on the natural resources survey. So I'll try to handle this one. The question is, are all aspects of the natural resources survey required to be completed before an application can be submitted to the certificate of location? So the answer to that is no. How that will work out is an applicant will, before submitting an application, will come to Texas Parks and Wildlife Department for that desktop consultation. And then once they've settled on a site through that desktop consultation, at that point, they will submit an application with the coordinates, the corner coordinates of that site. And then that site will be held for that applicant while they're then conducting the remainder of the natural resources survey, the sonar survey, and the ground survey. Anything to add to that, Kelly?
No, I think we've got it all.
Okay. How will the applications be accepted or submitted? Will that be online or in person?
I think it would be best. I don't think we've actually discussed this, but I think for consistency purposes and the fact that this is occurring, will be occurring across the coast and people from, all base systems can submit an application, that we would likely prefer online application submission. That way we have timestamps and, it's getting to the correct individual rather than being delivered by hand and, potentially getting misplaced.
Yeah, and by online, you're referring to email submission.
Yes,
Yeah,
the
we
email
don't
submission.
yet have a online portal, but yeah, via email to Kelly would be the way to submit that. Okay. Next question is, what is the buffer requirement from private shoreline? And I can answer that one, and feel free to jump in here, Kelly or Amy. This touches a little bit with the general land office. The buffer requirement for private shoreline is 1,000 foot unless there is written permission to site closer than that. Is that correct, Kelly?
I believe so.
Okay. Next question. Will certificates of location for restoration be issued for areas that are closed to traditional oyster harvesting?
We have discussed that, and yes, we will consider issuing COLs for restoration in areas that are closed for oyster harvesting.
Okay, that's all the questions we currently have in the Q&A. Okay, we got a couple more coming through. Keep sending those questions in if you're typing. We'll give it some more time. Okay, the question is, do the desktop consultations reserve the area the applicant is interested in, or is that only when the applicant is submitted?
It's only once the applicant is submitted and approved. We have to actually get that application and make sure that it lines up with what was discussed in the desktop consultation.
Yeah, and like we said with the previous question, that would, once that application is submitted and accepted, that would reserve that place while the applicant was conducting that the remainder of the natural resources survey. Any other questions, y'all? We'll give it just a little bit more time here if anybody's still typing. Okay, well, I'm not seeing any more questions coming through. As a reminder, y'all, if you have any questions that didn't get answered tonight, or you think of something after you're done, feel free to email us. There'll be an email associated with the follow-up email you get associated with this webinar. And then, like Kelly mentioned, we'll have in-person workshops tomorrow in League City and then in Rockport on Thursday night. And that said, I'll hand it back over to Holly to close us up.
Yeah, thanks, Zach. And I think you covered a lot of what I wanted to say. Just as a reminder, there will be that email coming from Zoom tomorrow with our Seafish email address where you can reach out to us with any remaining questions you might have. And then also a link to our education YouTube channel where you will be able to find a recording of this webinar. Again, like I said earlier, give us about 24 hours to get it up, but it will be there sometime tomorrow. So thank you everyone for joining us this evening. Thank you to all of our panelists who are here this evening as well. We appreciate it, and we will see you all next time. Thank you, everyone.